late afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will just kick off with this last session. You are very comfortably, of course, seated, but if you come closer, we can even have a better tank to think about, right? So if you want, please come closer. If not, you can stay. But we would appreciate if we can see you also, because we are all myopes here. Not necessarily, but thank you very much.
Very nice.
Thank you very much, and sorry for making you mobilized like this. So we will have a last session, and we will try to think about think tanks and the role of the think tanks in a century where we have the fourth industrial revolution, digital economy, and well, a multipolar and multi-axis global order. And also lots of unexpected things happening everywhere, from domestic politics of the even most maybe predictable countries like superpowers of the world, to the innovation and robotics, genetics, energy, whatever you take as an issue. We are certainly in an era where forecasting the near future, understanding the present, and taking into account the recent past is a permanent exercise of present tense. Therefore, we have to really try to refer to analysis, refer to wise persons, wise people, and we need more maybe data. Please come in and get closer. We need more data. Or not, I don't know. Maybe there is an excess of data, and we need more analysis, or not, we don't know, because there are so many analyses. So maybe we need better filters. Maybe we need better filters which can do the job for us, and which can really help us not only to understand the ever-changing global order and global issues, or domestic issues, or sectoral or industrial issues, or social issues, but also that can provide us with different parameters of analysis so that we can make a better use of all this data surrounding us. This is why we will have this session with very prominent speakers, Dr. Constanze Stelzen-Müller, Dr. Altay Atlı, and Dr. Andrew Kenny from very prominent institutions. You have the, of course, programs, so I will not insist on this. But I will start with some questions to our speakers, but it's a quiz. These are not the questions or topics that I had mentioned.
Are we winning anything?
Sorry?
Are we winning anything? Do we get prizes?
Applause. Certainly. We have another. Normally, on your program, you see that there is somebody missing here because he missed his plane. so Mr. Wang Guan is not with us. But let me ask you the first question. The first think tank of the history. Do you know? Well, Wikipedia knows, of course. And I will just read Wikipedia. The Zhixia Academy in China is an early ancestor of the modern think tank. Based on passages in the records of the grand historian, the academy is generally created by King Xuan and given a foundation date around 318 BC.
318. That's good.
Well,
Yes.
we can't compete with that.
And it is summarized as the first time on record a state began to act as a patron of scholarship out of the apparent conviction that this was a proper function of the state, and so on and so on. The second question, the largest think tank of the world. You should know this, no?
Is it
today? Social sciences?
Today?
Yes, today.
Cass in Beijing, maybe?
Brookings.
Really?
Yes.
I would have thought it would be Cass, actually.
The name of the think tank which is most mentioned in any conference.
Chatham House.
Chatham House.
Yes.
Chatham House
The
rule.
Chatham House rule, exactly. Right.
The university sending the highest number of students out of Turkey with scholarships. Koç University. So we have Brookings, Chatham House,
I knew the answer, but I
Koç
just didn't
University,
want
but
to,
you are very modest, I know,
do
Altay.
self-promotion.
Yes, likewise.
So we have really prominent speakers, as you see, from the legends of the think tank world.
For the first question, the first think tank in the
Yeah.
world, a Western-centric point of view will say, no, it's actually the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, which actually predates that. But that takes us to the discussion of, Western centricism and, global history and everything. Let's say, they had this in Greece, and
Good idea.
but there was this in China too.
That's a great
Yeah.
idea. That's a good idea to connect them both sides of the Silk Road then. All right. So then another question, because it's, everything changes and the think tanks change. Sometimes we call them do tanks now. Right? So do you think they are the think tanks or do tanks? To what extent there is this function of thinking and elaborating analysis, and to what extent there is this dimension of advocacy? So my first question then will be to all of you, starting with you, Constanze. What is think tank in the era of fourth industrial revolution?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's something that we've all been thinking about. Not just because the think tank space has become more populated, and because, of course, consultancies are competing with us as well, because we, if you will, compete with government ministries who have policy planning staffs who think they do this stuff better than we do. And the consultancies, of course, have a business model based on neither the governments nor the think tanks get it right, and you need to pay them huge amounts of money for the same kind of information. Right. So who is right? I would say that all of us have a function. I think most of us who do this kind of research and analysis in this space would say, from talking to our diplomat friends, our government friends, that increasingly in this day, our government friends seem to be engaged in 24/7 crisis management and tell us that they have a hard time, even in their own in-house strategy shops, to continue performing that function. And so our role in some way has become to perform a backstop for what governments or legislatures are trying to do, to tell them, to give them advice. But there is, at least in my mind, and in the mind of, I think, most think tanks, a distinct red line between advising, making policy recommendations, and actual advocacy. And in fact, under American tax law, we in Brookings are registered as a so-called 501c3, a public charity. Yeah. And we don't do lobbying. That is verboten. You'd have to be registered as a 501c4. So we need to be careful that we keep on the right side of that line. That said, in practice, that can be really quite difficult to do. And it's particularly difficult to do, and that brings me back to my original point. We're contested not just because there's increasing competition in this space, but also because in the current era of populism, people are criticizing us as dysfunctional and irresponsible elites. We're suddenly part of the bubble. And we are contested in the sense that our legitimacy is called into question as well. And that's also new for us. I don't know whether you experience this, but I'm certainly seeing it. And frankly, I think there's going to be more of it. So we have to be extra careful about how we comport ourselves, both in the quality and independence of our analysis, in the way that we run the business part of our operations, and in the way we communicate. That we aren't mistaken for doing something that we shouldn't be doing.
Wow, thank you very much. Tai?
Well, yes. Actually, I see think tanks, especially in today's world, in industry, for Neil, whatever you call it, but in today's globalizing, increasingly interdependent world where everything is intertwined with each other and so on, I see think tanks actually as connectors between the different actors. See, I want to give you an example from my own field. I'm doing international political economy. So actually, I'm in the academy, in the university, we are studying this world, how economies are being run, how they intersect with how the economic intersects with the political, how they influence each other, and so on. All right. So that But we are in the university. I'm teaching at the university. We are studying this, we are writing journal papers, and we publish them so that we can get a tenure and all these things. But at the same time, the world that we are studying, well, we have just one world. And so my experience is, if I can connect this knowledge, and here the think tanks are important, with, for example, the knowledge that is accumulated in the business sector through business organizations like this one, like TÜSİAD. And for those who are not familiar with, TÜSİAD calls itself like a factory of knowledge, right? There's a slogan like that. So I think the think tanks function, one of the think tanks function, especially in my field, will be, to connect the theoretical, analytical, produced by the academy, with the knowledge and experience on the field, well, because we are studying the same thing. It's not two different worlds. It's the same world, but two different perspectives. And think tanks can actually bring this two different perspectives together, because without the empirical knowledge accumulated here, the analytical, theoretical side will be just very abstract and, On this field, well, you have the empirical knowledge, accumulation of knowledge, because the business community, the business actors are the ones. If we talk about trade, well, you can build econometric models about trade, theorize on it and so on, but we also have people who are actually doing trade. So if you can connect them, well, you can come up with, real solutions to real world problems. The two can actually feed into each other. But if you stay in the academy, this is difficult. If you stay on the business field, this is difficult too. But think tanks are coming, in the scene exactly at this point. Wow. And this is why I think that this collaboration between the academy, business community, business representatives like TÜSİAD and think tanks is very important. I'm giving examples from my own field, international political economy, but I think, we can, use the same example for many different fields.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Andrew?
Well, I would agree that the points that have just been made. On top of that, two dimensions. Firstly, around the breadth versus depth of the topics that are addressed, and in a sense, who the audience is for any individual think tank. So at Chatham House, in London, essentially a UK think tank, but with a very global perspective. What is our perspective on Asia? And to the extent it's primarily, how do we interpret Asia for people in the UK, while also being a broader platform? We need to cover a lot of areas, but one needs some distinctiveness given the number of think tanks that there are, the other competing players in the space, and picking out a number of key themes. I think the second thing, historically, I was also involved setting up a think tank in Hong Kong. There's this question of pragmatism but objectivity between government and business, and the practicality you talked about with academia and bringing it all together and being objective. But doing that in a time when the very notion of objectivity has always been somewhat under criticism from an academic perspective, but culturally there's no such thing as objectivity. You're marshalling the interests of a certain class or elite. How does one deal with that? Where does that take one in terms of transparency and the transparency that we need to have on funders, for example, and who's commissioning research, but also the process of engagement. Chatham House has a new chair as of about 3 weeks ago, Jim O'Neill, who set up the BRICS concept when he was at Goldman Sachs. And one of the questions he was asked was, how do we engage people in the rest of the UK? Never mind should Chatham House be in Hong Kong or wherever, but what do we do outside of London at a time when the metropolitan London view is being criticized in the UK? Well, why aren't we going out and talking to people all across the UK? And his answer was certainly a mobile roadshow with Chatham House and having events in Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, wherever, but maybe more. Maybe we should look at that.
Actually, it's interesting that you should say that, if I may come in. We had a very similar conversation after the American elections at Brookings, and I spent the entirety of last year crisscrossing America, talking to people on the basis of invitations. I don't know whether you know this or you in the audience know this, but people tend to think that foreign and security policy interest is concentrated on the coast. So in New York, Washington, and maybe San Francisco. That's actually not true. America is dotted with these little franchises of the Council on Foreign Relations or the so-called World Affairs clubs, who are sort of organized in a federation, who try to bring speakers from government but also from the think tanks into the country to give talks about issues that interest people. And I think I gave 10 or I think maybe 12 talks from literally Rhode Island to Alaska and including Alaska, which I was very pleased with, because Alaska is beautiful and you've never been there, you should go. And people actually have really interesting things to say. I mean, it is worthwhile, even for us, to leave the capitals, to go to these places and to see, particularly in a time, and I'm not telling you anything new, in a time when the domestic and the international are becoming increasingly interconnected, and when the domestic contestation of foreign policy is narrowing the bandwidth of foreign policy options of those in politics, that makes it particularly useful and healthy to go out and talk to people. And I have to say, I have very fond memories of these conversations. For example, if you go to Des Moines, Iowa, where they have the first primaries in every sort of, congressional and presidential election, people in Des Moines are used to every 2 years, every 4 years, the entire press, not just of America, but of the world descending on them. And so they are extremely well informed because they're used to being interrogated by strangers who are not just American, but Japanese or Korean. And it is a lot of fun to learn what perspective people in the Midwest have. Because actually, you think this is pork and grains, but you know what? Pork and grain are globalized commodities. And so they're very interested in the political context of globalized trade. And this is particularly important, and I'll shut up then, is particularly important in a time when our politicians are tempted to respond to populists by deglobalizing and bringing home supply chains. It is important to see that out there, as it were, outside of the capital bubbles, there are people who are very interested in international affairs and who feel very connected to the world, and that's worth thinking about.
And that brings us to the question of this correlation or not between the political conditions, and the free thinking that think tanks need.
Yes,
now we
absolutely.
have this project. No, normally, how do you organize an academic work or a think tank work according to with the geography, Asia, Europe, Africa, you can do. But now we have this project, like the transatlantic partnership, maybe, but that is an old, of course, area of analytical work. But now with that we have this Belt and Road, New Silk Road, extending from the Pacific's eastern shores from Japan, South Korea, and of course China, all the way through across Asia, with northern and southern and in between middle roads, covering Middle East as well, covering the subcontinent of India before that, and then Central Asia, and Russian steppes and Russia, and Anatolia, and Northern Africa, and Europe, that is linked to United States, North America with transatlantic ties. So this is really a cross-border approach, but it is not necessarily global because it is focusing on certain areas where connecting people is translated into projects of telecommunication, infrastructure, energy, and so on. But where should be the domain, the field of thinking and guiding the policy making and the public opinions assessment with academic and analytical framework? And how cross-border it should be? And where is the playing field at the end of the day? Please start. Whatever, Altay.
Okay, well, the playing field is the entire region, the entire world. I think, parallel to the development of this project, Belt and Road project, I can sense, and believe me, I have a lot of contact with the Chinese side, like the think tanks, universities, including the government. I'm being invited to China, they come to Turkey, and so on. We talk and talk and talk. And I think actually this is a good thing, because China really needs to, be able to explain the project itself and to its entire vision, the whole vision of the world, because this is, in my opinion, still missing. Because for most of the people, whatever you learn about the BRI is, from the Western sources, including many of us. Most of us don't speak Chinese. We don't have access to Chinese sources, and the Chinese themselves are also, not really at that stage, despite those huge think tanks and so on. So, and when it's like that, when this is the condition, what happens is it's easy, very easy for all of us to be skeptical about the purpose of BRI. And you can simply, it's very easy to just read something about what the Communist Party says about BRI and then, dismiss it as Chinese propaganda and so on. Look, today, actually, the whole world is talking about if the BRI is a debt trap or not. Okay, so this is a point of view, and this is a very important point of view. But the thing is,
this is a good capital for the think tanks, right?
It is. But the thing is, we need more points so that we can connect them.
Yeah.
So, and here, and it's the Chinese job to do that. So therefore, think tanks, Chinese think tanks, we have many of them. So they need to be more active. They need to open up to the world more. They need to increase capabilities. And here, I just want to add a critical point here. I can see that they are increasingly active. So the thing is, at Koç University, we receive like a Chinese delegation every month now. Right. So today, CAS, then SAS, then SIIS, then this. And but the thing is, okay, quantity, fine, no problem about that. There's all the funding and everything and so on. But what is the content? What is the quality? So we have to work with the Chinese to improve this. We have to insist on increasing the quality, because I think it's a good opportunity that they are coming to me. I mean, they are coming to my campus. So, but the thing is, it's usually, some courtesy, getting to know each other, saying a few cliches about BRI, then they move on to their next meeting. So perhaps, we can work together to improve the quality of these think tank exchanges so that we can really have a debate about what BRI is or not.
Are you also saying that, for example, when I go for professional reasons to China, I visit R&D centers, technology centers, very impressive places, but are you saying that there is a distinction between that part of science and the social sciences, thinking about issues of society, economy, politics, international relations, they do not follow each other in parallel, or?
My experience is that there is a real gap between the think tanks, the social science producing think tanks, and other institutions who also produce knowledge but who also commercialize it at the same time. One experience, lately I've been to Beijing to visit, that wasn't the sole purpose, but I also visited 2 social media companies, and one of them was a very big one. They said it's the 7th largest social media company in the world in terms of revenues. And the first 6, them, probably all of them are in your mobile phone. And perhaps even this is in your mobile phone too, could be possible. Well, they had a very big campus, Google-like campus, and very smart people. We could discuss about many things, and research, development. It was a great experience. Okay, but that's a commercial institution. So I think the other ones that are not that commercialized, social science through think tanks, okay, commercialization is of course not the only issue here. There are many other issues involved, but I will say, from my own experience, they are coming a bit from behind in this sense.
Andrew?
Yeah. I think there are a couple of dimensions to this. Firstly, around how would one, Chatham House, Brookings, yourself, address Belt and Road Initiative. And an important part of that is how one engages with China. And there are some questions around engaging with China.
You can also tell us maybe on the ageability that you are...
Well, as ageability, we're also looking at connecting between the West, be it non-profit or for-profit, with China as part of this engagement. And it's that sort of mechanism which finds a way to engage with China, recognizing China has some differences, but you can't lead it to one side. You can't work you wouldn't want to work around it in an understanding of Belt and Road, just as you talked about, in going beyond the headlines and some of the words that get thrown around. In Belt and Road itself can have a very fuzzy and broad definition, so that it includes almost anything that China is doing in the world. And when you get to that level, then that begs the question, how do you research that? And you need people from different sectors, different viewpoints to come together within a Chatham House between different think tanks to provide an integrated perspective. And that includes specifically think tanks, research entities, or on-the-ground research in the countries that are affected by Belt and Road, how they're experiencing these projects day to day. And it requires good engagement with China. And I'm also affiliated with the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. And China, too, is seeking to learn and to improve what to do with Belt and Road. One has to approach it in a constructive way and say, look, there are all these issues which are happening with Belt and Road now in different countries. How can we make this better? How can we work together to do that? And then it's possible to have a very productive debate with a number of these think tanks. But there are differences in research style, working style, that do not communicate easily. When I was at this think tank in Hong Kong, we worked with NDRC looking at the development of the Chinese city, and they produced what was a very good, in a joint team, we produced a report worked very well for the Chinese system, but the mechanism of communication is different to a Western audience. We had to bring in some Westerners to help articulate the messages in a different way.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I think this is a fascinating discussion so far, and thank you. What I would add here is, I'm going to be even more frank. I think the great question that we have in the West, certainly in Europe and America, is this a commercial infrastructure project, or is this a geostrategic project? Is this about connectedness, or is this about establishing dominance, or winning a competition, a geostrategic competition? The answer to that question, or on the answer to that question, hinges a great deal. Government policy, attitudes of market participants, attitudes of societies, and of course it also has an impact for the work of think tanks. So that's something that we just need to find out. Now, regardless of what the answer to that question is, and I appreciate that the complexity of Chinese governance is such that depending on where you knock in Beijing or elsewhere, the answer to that question may be very different. Yeah? And that there is actually no unity or cohesion of vision even in the sort of hardcore of the Chinese government on this. I could even imagine that. I also agree with you that there is a real problem in sort of finding an intellectual bridge between Western and Chinese think tanks. I have absolutely no question that the Chinese have superb expertise, whether it's commercial or social science or geostrategic. In fact, I've met some extremely impressive Chinese geostrategists who are ruthlessly frank about what they think Chinese policy should be, and I frankly find that very invigorating. It helps me test my own assumptions and my own recommendations, and I enjoy that greatly. I find that if the Chinese are frank with you, it then becomes super interesting. But they do have to be frank, and part of it is also a question of language. And sometimes I think it might be quite useful if you know, the sort of by now enormous community of overseas Chinese, people who have grown up in other countries, who've grown up in the West, and who are able to be translators in the same way that some Europeans and Americans have now spent so much time in China that they would be able to do this the other way. Whether we couldn't use these communities to understand each other better. And again, I'm not making presuppositions here. I think that all of these elements are probably flying around in this electron cloud that is this debate. But the first thing, honestly, is to understand each other better, and there I think the Chinese part of the equation perhaps could do a little more to help us do this. I do think that, let me add a European perspective to this. It used to be, European discussions about China's role in the world used to be very much from the point of view of a, shall we say, game taker and rule taker. We were the small guys in this, and it was really the Americans and the Chinese who were talking over our heads. In many ways, it was sort of like the Americans and the Russians for a while were talking over our heads as well. Now it's very different. It's extremely different in an era of interdependence plus great power competition and Russian and Chinese presence in Europe. Being actors in Europe, and not just commercial actors, but economic policy actors and political actors and even security actors. That changes our framing as well, because this is suddenly about geopolitical competition in our own spaces in ways that 5 years ago we couldn't even imagine. So that has also changed the framing of our thinking.
While you are maybe preparing some words to add to this, questions from the floor, please.
Maybe a couple of responses. I would completely agree.
Please prepare your questions and go ahead, please.
Sorry. This question to how does governance change, and what is the role of China within that, what's the role of Europe within that, it comes directly into how does BRI play out, and it comes directly into how do you engage with think tanks. And I've noted in the past few days' discussion, a lot of the discussion here is really around the broad aspirations of BRI, I would say, which is around projects can work together. Ourselves have been working with EBRD on this. There's a wonderful case, the productive joint engagement around commercially bankable projects, which has as well a geostrategic dimension, sort of by definition, as China, now second largest, becomes the largest economy in the world. That does stand in contrast to, well, what is a BRI project or not, since the 5-year anniversary of the announcement of BRI, which to date has been primarily financed by the Chinese state policy banks and has not been open to competition and so on. And there are legitimate alternative models there. Question how that goes and the role in arguing the pros and cons of different routes for think tanks as ourselves. Just final point I wanted to mention, it struck me, you mentioned Asiability rather than the Chatham House. One of the entities we're engaging with is really a convening location called Ditchley Park in the UK, and we're supporting them. And they historically have been very much in the US-UK or Western tradition of the role of geostrategic politics, security, liberal values. And they are recognizing too and want to actively adapt to the new world, both in terms of some of the engagement we talked about right at the beginning around technology and about the role of China and how to engage with China. Historically, they haven't always had the right people being able to attend and have the right discussions, and helping get those right discussions with the right individuals that are frank and direct is really constructive engagement.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. Questions? Questions? Comments, please? Anybody, please go ahead.
So all of you have talked about, I'm from Koç University, a graduate student. So all of you talked about the importance of transmission of culture, ideas, etc. between think tanks and also peoples. So if you look at the Chinese civilization, it's a thousands of years of civilization with a massive traditions, etc. So West is trying to be ready to exchange ideas, but are the Chinese ready for this? Because they're extremely preserved culture, and like even when they go to, let's say, New York, they have their own Chinatown, and they're like sticking to their traditions, etc. So are Chinese ready for that?
Perception and reality can be different, of course, on the basis of facts. But anybody?
I can start perhaps. I think they are increasingly so. They are increasingly so, especially the younger generations of scholars, but not only them, also the younger generations of the Communist Party people, the party guys. So again, from my own experience of communicating with them or getting together with them in different parts of the world, including in China, so you can see that actually these guys are, the younger generation is more open. Okay, what they write, what they talk about, it's really getting more different. I mean, they are more open to communication and exchanging ideas. So because China is changing, the world is changing, and I can see that increasingly they will be more, open to this. And one thing to add here, we should also observe, also linked to the point you made. We should also observe how the Chinese think tanks institutionally are transforming themselves. Okay, and not only because you know, the older people are retiring and the young scholars are coming. Well, that's probably very important. But also, for example, something very interesting in China these days is, you know, we all have experience of working with those big names like CAS, the Chinese Academy of Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, all the others. These are all run by the government, like founded by the government, funded by the government, more importantly, and so on. But
to different parts of it.
and yes, definitely close to different parts of the government, to different organs of the government, let's say. But recently we also observe the emergence of new think tanks, which are founded by private individuals, especially those who have the financial resources. Perhaps it's too early to tell what kind of a difference they can make, but even the fact that they are now emerging, and I know about them as a Turkish person, is something, you know, that we will need to observe with optimism.
More comments or questions? Please, please. Yeah.
Cemile Tankurt, I'm a management consultant affiliated with Boğaziçi University. I have two questions to the think tank people, but you can answer as well. One is, what is the current weight or importance of the discussions or meetings you have inside your organizations in relation to BRI topics? And second, how do you actually foresee the headlines of these discussions changing in the coming few years? If it's now commercial oriented, what do you think will be the new topics that we will be discussing in the next 5 years? Thank
Predicting
you.
the future. Because think tanks, of course, were successful in predicting who will be the president of the United States of America or how Brexit will happen. But let's start with Constanta.
Honestly, I am probably the wrong person to ask on this because I work for the Center in the United States and Europe, and I'm a European foreign and security policy specialist, and I do transatlantic relations. I'm really interested in this as a global geostrategic topic, but I'd really have to ask my colleagues where they are on this. I mean, I had a little bit of back and forth with them to prepare myself for this conference, and my sense is that they have a very nuanced assessment, which I've tried to transport here, of the potential directions in which this initiative could go, not least because of the multiplicity of views within the Chinese government and within the Chinese state, but also because we are currently almost suspended in midair with regard to, in a very volatile global security situation and indeed economic situation. If there is a return of a Eurozone crisis in Europe, if there is a global financial crisis, then a lot of the BRI, it seems to me, suddenly no longer just becomes an issue for Brookings' China Center, but also for its Global Economic Governance Center. Yeah? In other words, these things could shift around within the House. And to the extent that BRI, certainly as seen from Europe, is also seen as a geostrategic initiative, I actually do have an interest in it. Yeah? And particularly when, you know, if you look at the whole palette of Chinese activities in Europe, there are, as you say, BRI could be a completely benign, you know, wealth and prosperity enhancing project for all of us. But if you add to that the sort of Chinese investment in Confucius centers, the pressure on universities, the pressure on think tanks in Europe, if you add to that cyber espionage, economic cyber espionage and political espionage, then things become a little different. And the question is always for us, I mean, all of us do connecting the dots, right? And the question is, can we connect these dots or not? Are these things separate in the Chinese mind, or are they connected? That will be something that we will want to know in the future.
Absolutely. Andrew.
Yes, and back to the role within Chatham House, I think, in a sense, your answer, within the Asia program and spreading into Central Asia and indeed Africa and those areas, it's very important. It's one of the main topics we engage in. I would say, to a large extent, from the perspective of the countries that have been the recipients or are going to be the recipients of investment. And the work goes into these two routes I was laying out. One is, let's look at the Sri Lanka example, let's look at CPEC in Pakistan and understand who's benefited, what risks there be, what difficulties there are, what routes there are for restructuring some of that and the full implications. The other is, well, with an EBRD or an HSBC, the Chinese have made some very public statements that they want this to be an open initiative with private sector money, commercial terms, want to improve governance, sustainability. We have some cooperation ongoing on sustainability from Chatham House into China on this. Well, let's take that the next stage. Let's see how that gets growing. Right. And what will we know in 5 years' time? We'll know whether that was more dreams when some commercial banks were looking at China and saying, I'm going to be really big in China. Yeah, or, exactly. Is it bad? Is it people in the West and in Turkey sitting and saying, we want this? Or is it actually the reality? And it's unclear at this stage.
Can I add perhaps one point on this? Please. Obviously, one point that really got people's attention in the West was Djibouti. Now, I used to be a newspaper writer, and I remember going to Djibouti in 2005 when there was still the maritime element of Operation Enduring Freedom, which is the follow-on operation of NATO and an international coalition after the Taliban were chased out of Afghanistan, and the maritime component was based in Djibouti. So it's also at the time there was a US Marine base there. It's also the home of the biggest French armed forces base outside of France, 3,000, mostly French Foreign Legion. And there was also clearly a lot of, shall we say, intelligence service sneaking around going on. CIA, you name it, everybody was sneaking around there, and there were stories about Djibouti being used as a base for Predator drones, for example, even then in 2005. Now, that's 13 years ago. Now the Chinese are big in Djibouti, and the Djiboutian port becomes nationalized. The port is key for all the stuff I've just described. And presumably, last time I checked, if it was that, it's probably double that Western involvement in Djibouti now. So if the port is nationalized, if the Chinese play such a big role, then that is a significant piece of the puzzle in moving the needle towards the assumption that this might be at least as much about geostrategy as it is about commercial opportunities.
Yeah. I'll come back in on Djibouti specifically just because we were talking about that over dinner last night. Firstly, from the Djibouti perspective, they're now very happy because they've got an additional partner to balance against the US. They're getting it, and the French, and the Indians now want to come in. I think the Japanese are there. And they're getting lots of investment from the Chinese. They're actually getting a pretty good deal out of this. So there's that perspective. Your point about connecting the dots, I mean, far be it from me to get to a definitive answer on that, and I don't have that in a sense. But it's not that there's an interconnected plan, but things are very connected. Everything is connected to everything else, and economics leads to geostrategic questions automatically. So I think it's clear there are both dimensions in the Djibouti situation and elsewhere.
Yeah, just one point, linking it to the question actually, and also referring to the connecting the dots, and also going back to the very first point I made when I talked about the function of the think tanks. Now I'm affiliated with Koç University's Asian Studies Center, and the Belt and Road Initiative is the top item now in the agenda of the center. Our center is run by a sociologist. I'm doing international political economy, and we have economists and so on. Okay, but what the most important thing is, in my opinion, is because the Belt and Road Initiative has so many different dimensions. It's a complex set of reality actually. What is important is not what these think tanks, like my Asian Studies Center at Koç University or the others are doing, but the different, not only think tanks but institutions in general, knowledge-producing institutions, how they communicate with each other, how they add to their, understanding. Example from within the Koç University. What I learned about the Belt and Road Initiative and Turkey's perspective of the Belt and Road Initiative. Within the Koç University, mostly came not from the Asian Studies Center, but from the Maritime Studies Forum, which is run by a retired admiral who actually moderated the previous forum here. I can see him now in the room, but you know, I mean, they bring another perspective, the Navy perspective and the maritime perspective, and the business community, as I said. So what's important is, you know, actually not so much what we do as think tanks, but how much we can communicate with each other, to connect the dots, to put the pieces of the puzzle together so that we can see the whole picture.
Thank you very much. It's so easy to moderate a session with think tankers. The debate is certainly to be continued. It's not over, but this session is over. This conference is over. Thank you very much for your participation. It was a very fruitful debate. Thank you for your participation. Thank you.